All right. I just want to know about the two goats again, if you have time.
Sure, Brother Sam. All right, I want to repeat before I comment on the two goats. I just want to repeat that it is one of the topics that causes a lot of controversy and disagreement.
Yes,
Uh,
it does.
but I'm very strongly persuaded of the point of view that I shared a few weeks ago, and I'm going to repeat it, Brother Sam. Now, the thing is that there's a statement in the book of Leviticus which says that the goat that is led away into the wilderness is to make an atonement. And it is this one statement that makes people believe that the goat represents Jesus. Now, remember, there are two goats. The priest or whoever was to cast lots,
One
and
question.
one goat.
Just a question. The atonement was already made by the first goat. It was already done. Jesus had already, blood was already spilled for the first goat, right? The atonement was
Yes,
already made. So I
yes,
think that.
the shedding of blood was already done by the first goat, but then the statement is made
Mhm.
about the second goat that it was to make an atonement. It is said specifically about the second goat. So that is why people come to that conclusion. But I'm saying that even though the word atonement is used,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily mean that the goat represents Christ. It depends on what the word atonement means. And what I try to point out is that when we talk about atonement, in the context of Christian theology, the word has a very limited meaning. They interpret the word atonement to mean strictly the shedding of blood to compensate for our sins or to make as a means of canceling our guilt. So they view the word atonement in this way. But what we understand from the Day of Atonement, and what we understand from looking at the context of the great conflict between God and Satan that started long ago, is that there is a bigger question in the universe than just the question of how is man saved. There's a question of the accusations that Satan brought against God. They are to be answered at the end. And there's a question that is hanging over everything, and it is this: who is really responsible for sin? Who is really to be blamed for sin? Now, when that question is finally answered, then the universe will come back to its oneness with God. And the Bible teaches this. The Bible says that the whole universe is to be reconciled back to God. Jesus is to win the battle, and he's to hand the kingdom back over to his Father. This is when the atonement is complete. Now, until the question is settled, who is to bear the blame for sin? It's not over. And that question is answered during the Day of Atonement. And that is why the Bible says that the sins are confessed on the head of the scapegoat, of Azazel, because it is the scapegoat, or what is called the scapegoat. It's not really the scapegoat. It is Azazel who represents Satan. It is Satan who is ultimately responsible for all the sins that people have committed. You might blame Hitler, you might blame Nero, whoever, but ultimately the person responsible is Satan. And so at the end, the blame will be placed upon Satan, who is the other goat. As I pointed out also, the goat is universally accepted to be a symbol of the devil. It's used in Satan worship, and all the symbols that are used in pagan worship tend to circulate around the image of the goat. Now, the other thing about it is, why were both animals exactly the same? Why not have a lamb for Jesus and a goat for Satan? Then it wouldn't be any problem. But the thing is, it emphasizes the fact that Jesus was made to be sin for us.
Right.
In terms of the way Jesus was treated, he was treated exactly as Satan is to be treated, because the Spirit of God was taken away from him and he was left alone with no trace of God. He hung alone on the cross. God abandoned him completely, which is the position that Satan is in. So he was made to be sin for us that day, and that is why the symbol of a goat is used to represent Christ in this ceremony. So the other thing about it is that it is inconsistent and it is unreasonable to think that there are two different animals that are exactly the same, doing two completely different things, and the both of them represent Jesus. That doesn't make sense. If Jesus is a sacrifice, then he puts an end to sin with his death. There doesn't need to be a model of him now carrying away the sin into the wilderness and being left out there in the wilderness. That doesn't make sense. So that clearly also points to the fact that this goat represents a different person. It doesn't represent Christ.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was clear enough, Brother Sam, but those are the comments.
Very clear, Brother David. And that's what I thought anyway. And I always was thought that the record of sin in the sanctuary, the record of sin was put on the devil's head. The record, because all sin was left. Now, when the record of sin was removed, that means in the holy place there was no sin. There was no record of sin. Jesus had already died for the sinners, so there was no records, no nothing of sin. And it was put on the one who started it all, and that was Lucifer.
Yes, I suppose that is one way of putting it, Brother Sam, to say the record is put there. I suppose a record is really the evidence of blame.
Yeah,
So the record, yeah.
well, but because of the law, it was a record because of the law.
Well, I think it's bigger than just the record, because the thing is that it's
Yes,
it's it's a settling of the question, who is responsible?
Satan.
Absolutely. So I agree that the record of what has happened in the history of sin
Yes,
is a part of the whole process, but ultimately the final question is, all of this evil, all of this sin, all of these wrongs that were committed, all of the sinful nature, everything, how, one of the questions that people have, even philosophers have this question, um, how did sin begin? And who is responsible? Because some people even blame God, because they say God must have created evil, because evil cannot create itself. And since God created all things, they say God must have created evil. So those questions are there to be answered. And until these questions are comprehensively answered, then the conflict cannot be over. So the lesson of that final act of the Day of Atonement is that in the final judgment on the Day of Atonement, that question will be settled and the blame will be placed upon Satan. God never started evil. God is not in any way to blame. It is
no,
absolutely completely on the head of Satan. So that is what that service is about.
yes. And I always was thinking that the record of sin, the reason why I said a record of sin is because remember now, we have the law and the books was open. Now, what you have in a book, you got to have something written down in a book. And the books was open. So those books was my sins and your sins is not no longer in the book because they are blotted out by the blood of God, by Jesus. But the record of sin had to be taken out of the sanctuary and is out and was put on the head of that goat. And so that is no record of sin. And that's why all God's children could stand in the most holy place sinless, right? Because there's no record. We
All right.
already been forgiven, but then also there's no record.
I understand that, Brother Sam. That's what we're going to look at this evening. So I'll hold my comments on that until we actually get into it. All right?
Okay, very much. I appreciate that.
All right, Brother Sam.
I have
Sister
a
Carita.
question.
Hi, Sister Carita. Go ahead.
Brother David, it's good to see you. I have a question, please.
You're quite
Now,
welcome. Go ahead.
in Zechariah 14, about 16 to 20, the feast keepers use it to justify their celebrations. Could you give me or us some insight as to your understanding of those verses as it relates to feast, please, and feast keeping now?
Sure. All right. I'm going to bring up my Bible, and I see, Brother Modest, I see that you're going to make a comment. If it's not a long comment or a question that requires an answer, then I could take it before I actually look at this, because this is going to take me a little bit of time. So, but if not, Brother Modest, maybe you can You can hold it for a moment. All right, is it a short point?
I don't know if it's a short one, but it's just something I want you to consider. Maybe you don't have to answer it now, but it is something that they were someone presented to me about um, in the book of Obadiah that they were it talks about a prophecy about the Edomites, that there is no salvation for the Edomites, and it's at the time of Esau that white people came to be, and they were only brought in the world for a particular task, something like that. And his exact point is like there's no salvation. God, there's only salvation for black people, and there's no salvation for white people. So I just wanted you to consider this properly. I don't know if you heard about it. Maybe you can touch
Sure.
on it. Yeah.
Yes, Daniel commented on it this morning, but I'm going to look at Sister Caritha's question, and then I'll come back to this brother Modest. And Sister Iris, you can go ahead with your question. Sister Iris, your mic is unmuted, but it seems like your audio is not working because I'm not hearing anything. Good to see you, Jordan. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll look at the question you asked, Sister Caritha. In Zechariah 14, and it's not just a verse that you mentioned, Sister Caritha, but the entire chapter is worth reading. When anybody sets out to interpret Zechariah 14, I would advise reading the entire chapter, because you can't read one part of it in isolation. Now, there's a verse that you mentioned where it says that, let me come down to the verse itself. It says in verse 16, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the reason why this is a troubling verse is because it's in the middle of a passage which begins by saying that the day of the Lord will come, and it says, here's what it says: his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. Now, this is an event that people understand to refer to the coming of the Lord, and because it talks about his feet standing on the Mount of Olives and all of that, and it goes on to say, I mean, there is a clear indication here that this is referring to the new earth, because it says in verse 8, and it shall be in that day that living water shall go out from Jerusalem. You can go to Revelation and you can see that there's a pure river of water of life flowing from the throne of God. It says in verse 9, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one. And so it's in this context that we come upon this verse where it says that they shall go out, they shall worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So, of course, people who believe in keeping the feast will jump on this verse and they will say, you see, in the earth made new, we will be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. But we shouldn't stop there. We should go a little further. In verse 17, it says, and it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. If we conclude that this is referring to the earth made new, then we have to conclude that in the earth made new, there are going to be people who will not come to worship God, and God will punish them by not sending rain upon them. And furthermore, it says, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So apparently, whatever he's talking about, there are going to be heathen who don't obey, and there are going to be people who have no rain. Look at what it says again in verse 21. Yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts. Look at what it says next. And all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe therein or boil therein. So you not only see that people are keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, but you see that they are offering sacrifices. Offering sacrifices, and ostensibly what they are offering is animal sacrifices. Not only are they offering animal sacrifices, but also there are people who are disobedient and they won't be worshiping the Lord of hosts, and God is going to punish them by not sending any rain. So the question is, how do we reconcile all of these things together? I'm saying if you're a feast keeper, if you believe in keeping the feast, you must accept the entire passage. If you accept it as literal, you must accept the entire passage as literal. Don't pick out one part and leave that apart. If you're going to say this is referring to literal feast keeping in the new earth, then you have to say that literally they are going to be offering sacrifices in the new earth. Those of you who know Ian Boyne, this Jamaican talk show host, he interviewed me once on his program, and he asked me about this verse, and I actually gave him the same answer. I took him to the verse that says they'll be offering sacrifices, and he didn't know how to answer. He fumbled with his response and then kind of brushed past the question, which he will do quite often, which he used to do quite a bit when he couldn't answer the question. So how do we understand the whole passage? I'm going to have to be a little generalized here, Sister Carita, and this is something that we have actually looked at in the past, the principle. But I'm going to be a little short in explaining this principle. The prophecies of the Old Covenant. Let me try to be very deliberate so that my point can be well made. The prophecies of the Old Testament in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Malachi, many of these prophecies, as a matter of fact, I would say all of these prophecies are given, are stated in the language and the context of the culture in which the people live. Many of these Old Testament prophecies, people take them literalistically and think they're going to be fulfilled literalistically, like prophecies that talk about Israel dominating the nations around them in the last days. People who don't understand this principle, they think that Israel in Palestine is going to fight against the Palestinians and overthrow them, that God is going to use the nation of Israel to physically make war and fight against other nations and overcome them. They are still in the physical Old Covenant because they take these Old Covenant prophecies and apply them literalistically. But it should be very clear, this is not how these prophecies are to be interpreted. When God talks about a warfare in the last days, and he says there will be chariots and horsemen, do we believe that there are going to be wars fought in the last days using horses and chariots? Daniel 11 mentions the king of the north coming against the king of the south with chariots and horsemen. And that's a last days prophecy. Obviously not. What God does is he uses the language and the imagery of the old covenant, and he expresses an idea of conflict, an idea of different things happening, and you have to read through the parable and interpret the parable. These prophecies are written like parables. For example, let me give you another one. Here's what it says, and Adventists like to use it. Sabbath keepers like to use this prophecy, but as all of us know, it is untenable to apply it this way. Let me just switch quickly to the prophecy I have in mind. Most of you know already where I'm going. I'm going to Isaiah chapter 66, and just look at the last few verses of this chapter, the last couple of verses. Look at what it says. Go to the King James Version, which we are familiar with, in Isaiah 66. Sorry, I'm in Isaiah chapter 1. Chapter 66 is what I want. Isaiah 66. Look at this verse. From verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, said the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, said the Lord. It's a favorite verse that Sabbath keepers use, and it says that clearly it's talking about the new heavens and the new earth and people coming to worship God. But notice that it says from one new moon to another. If you're going to use this to prove that people are going to be worshiping the Sabbath on the Sabbath, then you have to also make it clear that people are going to be worshiping on the new moons. Furthermore, when you go to verse 24, which is in the same breath, you can't separate it. It says, and they shall go forth to look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. So you have to conclude that one of our Sabbath pastimes, one of the pleasures we will take in the earth made new, is to go out and look upon the people who are being eaten by worms from Sabbath to Sabbath, who are in this everlasting burning torment where the worms do not die and their fire is not quenched. And that will be a part of our Sabbath pleasure. So this is the pattern of old covenant prophecy. What happens is that God uses the imagery of the time and the understanding of the time. What are we to understand about this? What God is saying here, look at this passage and just look at this entire thing. All of this, if you take the details of it, you end up with a confusing picture, an impossible picture. But if you understand the principle that is being advocated, what is God doing? God is understanding what Israel, what the people of Israel consider to be a perfect system, their idea of perfection based on their place, based on their emphasis on the law, based on their understanding of what a perfect life would be. Their understanding is when all that opposes them is consigned to the garbage heap, to a burning place where worms are eating dead bodies and so forth. That's the Valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem. Their idea of perfection is where they get to keep all their feasts and their Sabbaths undisturbed. And so God gives them a picture that fits their idea of utopia. And what God is saying, in the earth made new, everything is going to be perfect according to your understanding of perfection. It's like you Sister Carita, I don't know if well, you probably wouldn't know. My father used to use this phrase, but it comes from an old Jamaican play or something, an old Jamaican song. But the song goes like this. One line of the song goes like this. It's talking about Adam and Eve, and it says, and every day was Christmas Day, then get them pudding free. Now, it says every day for Adam and Eve was Christmas Day. Now, if you take the words literally, what it is saying is that every day was the 25th of December and whatever, but you know it doesn't mean that. What the songwriter is borrowing from the idea of Jamaican children, the idea that Christmas is a time of merriment and happiness and everything is ideal. And it was like this for me as a boy. Christmas, I always got my present. So if somebody said Christmas was every day, I would be filled with joy. So if I wanted to talk about a perfect life, I would say Christmas. So God is doing this. He is highlighting the Jews' idea, let me say, of Christmas Day. Of course, they wouldn't talk about Christmas. They'll talk about the system where their idea of utopia, and God gave them that image. Now, in Zechariah 14, to not prolong it, God is speaking about the final moments when everything is going to be brought to an equality. And what he's saying is that according to the Jews' idea of perfection, that is what would happen. They'll get to keep their Feast of Tabernacles. The enemies of God would be overthrown. Everybody would have to obey God or they would be punished. That's their idea of perfection. So we don't take the details of the story. We take the meaning behind the story. And that is exactly how God works. If you look at the parables of Jesus, okay? Jesus told a story. I was pointing this out. It could have been Thursday or last night, but Jesus told a story Jesus told a story about a man who died and went to hell. And he had an associate, well, not an associate, a beggar who used to sit at his doorway and beg, who also died and went into Abraham's bosom. Now, only a fool would believe that dead people go into Abraham's bosom. Only a fool would believe that, well, a lot of people who are not fools believe that when people die, they go straight to hell and they start to be roasted and they end up roasting forever. But anyway, you look at the story, and if you think it's a literal story, then you're foolish, because it tells you things that you know don't literally happen. People don't go into Abraham's bosom when they die. So what do we do with the story? We take the point of the story. We forget the details of the story. So this is basically a principle that we apply when we look at Old Testament prophecies. We take the principle behind the prophecy and not the details. If we take the details, like many Christians do today, there is a great deal of confusion. And not only this, it's that people come to think of God as an unreasonable, confusing person whose ideas make no sense at all. So without prolonging it too much, Sister Carita, that is my kind of shortish, kind of longish answer to the question. So just unmute and let me know if you understood what I just said. If not, I'll continue a bit more.
You can continue a little bit more. I
All right.
understand what you say, yes, the principle of it, but I can't exactly have a arguable or reasonable conversation and say, listen, is the principle. What else can I add to add more meat to what I will share with them? What else can I say other than, is the principle of these verses, these stories, and not so much the details. Anything else I could perhaps add?
What I can do is I can find other examples in the Old
Okay.
Testament and give you other prophecies, and I can show you a number of them that make no sense if they're applied literalistically. It's not just the principle pertaining to this particular prophecy. It's a principle pertaining to how we interpret the Old Covenant prophecies in particular. So
Okay.
that's what I'm trying to say. There's a study on YouTube that I think I entitled "The Greatest Parable," and when I was doing that presentation, I came to understand something about the Bible that was at the moment for me a kind of new revelation, because I didn't understand that God's greatest way of teaching is using parables.
Okay.
So you can know when you look at Jesus, because the Bible says that he never spoke to the people without a parable. And a parable, by definition, is using a story to make a point, and sometimes the story has nothing to the details of the story have nothing to do with the point you're making. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The story of the rabbit going for a race with the turtle. Rabbit and the turtle decided to go for a race. The rabbit fell asleep on the way after he shot off and had a good lead, and the turtle just kept plodding and went past the rabbit. Now, if somebody tells you that it's a story about a rabbit and a turtle, they're wrong. It's not about a rabbit and a turtle. And if somebody tells you that a rabbit went to race a turtle because the story says so, this person is foolish. It's not about that. No rabbit went for a race with a turtle. Somebody tells the story, and what they want to say is, if you set out to do a task, stick with it. It's better than being enthusiastic and zealous, and then you end up not accomplishing your task. It has nothing to do with a rabbit and a turtle, but the story is about a rabbit and a turtle. So you don't take the story, you take the meaning of the story. And you can see that this is true in all the parables that Jesus told. And that is why people misunderstood him, because they were trying to understand the details of the story. Like when Jesus said, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. What did the people say? How can this man give us his blood to drink? And they turned back and they stopped following him. They didn't understand what he was saying. Now the entire Bible Well, let me say, in particular, the Old Testament is written like this. It is a great parable, and the prophecies and the stories there are parables, and this is why people misunderstand it so much. The prophecies, the prophecies now, especially these prophecies in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah here, they are written in the language. They are expressed in the lifestyle and the understanding of the people. But then the question is, what is the point? How are we to understand them? So, what I'll do, Sister Carita, I look for other examples and I'll share them with you.
Okay. So what we're saying is that feast is going to be kept when Jesus returns. And this is what the Israelites at the time wanted to hear, that they'll pretty much have quote unquote Christmas when Jesus comes. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, partially. But let me break it down a little bit more. Okay. It does not mean that feasts were going to be kept.
Okay.
It means that in their minds, the Jews had an idea of perfection.
Right.
Their idea of a perfect system involved feast keeping.
Right.
It involved new moons, Sabbaths. It involved the destruction of their enemies. It involved a system where their system of worship, they were free to practice it without any hindrance or any obstruction.
Okay.
So God gave them a picture of their idea of perfection.
Okay.
So a Jew would look at it and he would say, it's going to be a wonderful time. For you and me, we understand that when in the earth made new, these will not be the elements of perfection, because we understand God's purposes in a far greater and better way. But
Right.
it would do for the Jews, because in the context of their limited understanding, it gave them something that comforted and it told the truth, but it told it in a parable. And for them, the parable was good. For us, we have to interpret the parable.
Got it. What's your view on spiritual Jews and Gentiles being quote unquote spiritual Jews?
I am an Israelite spiritually, because
Okay.
the scripture says, if I belong to Christ, I'm an Israelite, I'm Abraham's seed, okay? But it has nothing to do with bloodlines and color or race. Absolutely not. It's just because those who are of faith, Abraham's seed, the true seed of Abraham, is those who have faith. This is what the Bible teaches in Galatians and other places. So I am a child of faith, and so are you. So we are the true Israel of God, but we are not the true, we are not Jews in the literal sense.
Okay.
The literal Jews are no longer God's people. They were God's people in the parallel system, but not in the real system.
Okay. Thank
Brother
you so
Clayton,
much.
that's sorry, that's what the guy also, I think he said he's from Black Israelites, the group Black Israelites. That's where he's from, and he was telling me about these things about bloodline, that we are black people are is the true Israelites because of bloodline, you know, and and all these things about white people. There's no salvation for white people, and all of these stuff that I don't know if that's the common belief that they all believe. The group Black Israelite, but you know, I don't know, but we he has all of these texts showing me about Deuteronomy 28, about the curses and the blessings, and because the real Israelite did not obey God, that's why God placed them under bondage, and this is why black people went into slavery and all of this stuff. And he's saying that if you reinterpret Obadiah, the book of Obadiah, that you're gonna see it unfold like something about black people. There's only salvation for black people, and there's no salvation for white people. He said in the book of Obadiah, that's the prophecy that is depicted there.
But Brother Modest, I will say these teachings are antichrist, and these the people who promote them are a pain. Okay, you probably didn't were not with us early this morning, but interestingly, The first presentation by Daniel was, it commented on those same exact points, the same exact points that you just raised. Typically, and I'm going to say this, typically, these people who promote these ideas, they will never come to the New Testament. They are Old Testament Christians. They are not Christian. They focus on the Old Testament because they do not understand the New Covenant. They belong to the Old Covenant. They belong to a system that has been made obsolete by God thousands of years ago. All that a person has to do is to read, is to understand the book of Galatians. And those questions are overthrown. You don't even need to go anywhere else in the Bible other than the book of Galatians. Okay? Now,
Daniel, I know
Thank you.
they were
Yes,
talking about, yeah, I know you, well, I listened to your sermon this morning about the Black Israelites, and I just want to give an opposite view of that. I mean, what some people are believing, which is totally wrong too, okay? That Black people were not even descendants of Noah. They came over as cargo on the ark, which is, I mean, you got the one side that's saying they're the blessed of God, and the other side saying no, they're just cargoes, they're just animals. Both of them are
oh,
wrong. We're children of God. It doesn't matter your color, and people need to get over that. Get over the race. It's just it's Satan trying to divide everybody.
I agree with you 1,000%, brother Al. And as I pointed out this morning, when you are not when you depend on men to lead you, and you depend on popular opinion, denominationalism, what ends up happening is that any wind of doctrine that comes along will sweep you off your feet, and you accept nonsense because you have no foundation, you have no basis for what you believe, and you have no relationship with God. So, as you said, these are all equally satanic doctrines. I agree with you 100% there. But I'm thankful for
Also,
this platform where we are able to share truth freely.
yeah, I just wanted to make a small comment. Also, I heard part of the your sermon this morning. I came in a little late. I didn't hear the beginning of it, but I was sharing with the brother when he was saying all of these racist stuff to me. I took him to Acts 10:34, and I mentioned this to him. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, "Of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted of him." So God is not a God of um, color or this or that, whatever you are, whoever you are. Once you are in righteousness, this is what he's interested in. And in every nation, it says, every nation, no matter who you are. So he didn't take it lightly. He went on, but
I see that is back on, but just to answer your brother Modesta, I don't think logical scriptural reasoning gets across to these people. I mean, somebody made a point to one of them that the Bible says God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Their response to the person is that the word used there is loved, which is a past tense word. So God loved the world in the past, but now his love is only for the black Israelites, which of course is them. So it's all utter nonsense. But that is back now. So I'll allow him to proceed with what he was saying.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we
Yes.
can.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
brother. Yes, we can hear you, brother
All right,
David.
thank you. My computer is saying that my audio is off. But what happened is that there is a little bit of lightning around, and apparently it's knocked out the internet. It cut off the electricity, and so I apologize for that. I had to hurry and get some data on my phone, which is what I'm using now. So I hope it will take us through to the end of our time this afternoon. I think it's wisdom for me to just spend the time trying to respond to the questions that we have and not try to actually do a prophecy study this afternoon. But yes, I was saying before I got cut off that it's a matter of a failure to understand the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant. The old covenant, once we understand the principle I was trying to explain to Sister Caritha, the old covenant is a model. The entire system was a model. Israel was a model of the people of God. Israel was not the people of God. They were labeled as the people of God. But who are the people of God? It is those who have the Spirit of Christ. Did the Israelites have the Spirit of Christ? All you had to do to be labeled a child of God was you had to be born a Jew, and you became one of God's people. They were never God's people. They were labeled God's people because God set up a system of representation. The entire system was representative. Their holy city was representational. Their race was representational. Their kingdom was representational. It all pointed to something greater in the future. Today, God's people are the true Israelites. So the point is, when Jesus came was the beginning of God's plan of redeeming the human race. Until Jesus came, what we had in the past was a model. So the Feast of Passover was there, which represented the death of Christ. The Feast of Pentecost was there, which represented the giving of the Holy Spirit. Everything in that system, the killing of a lamb was there, which represented the death of the Son of God. Everything was a model of reality. So you can't take the statements of the old covenant, the statements focusing on the Jews and Israel, and immortalize them. They were limited because they were representational, and that is what these people do. And it's not them alone. There are people who are not as gross and outrageous like these Hebrew Israelites, but in their own way, they propagate similar falsehoods because they propagate the idea of the people in Israel still being favored by God, the people down there in Palestine. They propagate the idea of God using one race to wage warfare against another race, or one nation to wage warfare against another nation. They are still locked into old covenant mindset, and the old covenant was a type or an illustration. It was illustrative religion. It was not reality. When Jesus came, he said to the woman, she said, our fathers worship in this mountain. You Jews say that we should worship in Jerusalem. Old covenant religion. Where is the right place of worship? Jesus says, the hour is coming and has now arrived. The hour had come when you shall neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship God. Because God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. We are in the age of spirit and truth, brothers and sisters. We worship God in spirit and truth, not according to these base, carnal, earthly, limited means of worship. When Paul talks about it in Galatians 4, he says, we were children. We were put under the elements of the world. You know what? We need to go back and look at the lesson in the book of Galatians. Maybe not this evening, but we need to do that because some of these things need to be really clarified and cemented in our minds. They were children, and because they were children, God put them under the elements of the world. But we have come to the place where we have graduated to adulthood, or we ought to be at that place and understand God is no longer relating to his people in that way. Sister Michelle, go ahead.
Brother David, it's Sister Michelle's husband. It's Brother Enoch, brother.
Brother Enoch, okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a quick question. I think that what you actually touching on makes me feel like it's the same thing with the shepherd wives who believe a lot of the Old Testament prophecies. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Especially Ezekiel 9. So while you're talking about that, I'm thinking, did Sister White understand the new covenant as you cover it?
Well, you bring me back into that troubling era. But if you ask me my honest answer, brother, I will have to say that there are statements I've read that make me believe she didn't. Okay, she said something. Here's something that she said. She says the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai is just as much in force today as it was then. she quotes where the Israelites say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And she says that this is the covenant. I don't want to misrepresent and misquote, but let me maybe find the quote and just share it with you very quickly so that I don't misrepresent. I don't want to do that. I know when I say something like this, somebody's going to demand that I show the proof. Maybe not here, but people will do that. So let me just read it quickly. It's not our topic this evening, but I don't think there's any harm in bringing it up. Let me read a couple of statements here. It says, it's in SW, the Southern Work. I think that's the title of that publication. The covenant that God made with his people at Sinai is to be our refuge and defense. The covenant made at Sinai. It says, and Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before their faces all these words. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. This covenant is of just as much force today as it was when the Lord made it with ancient Israel. So just to answer you briefly, brother Enoch, statements like this make me conclude she didn't understand, because you can't understand the issue of the two covenants and make a statement like that. We are not under the old covenant, the covenant of Sinai. We are not under that covenant. Paul says about that covenant, that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. God said, I'll make a new covenant. We can't be under the new and the old at the same time. So without going into it too deeply, I will say I am persuaded she didn't understand the subject of the covenants properly. Otherwise, she could not have made a statement like that. Anyway, not to start a big.
I definitely concur.
All right. So I don't know if there is any other question that we need to look at. All right, I promise, Sister Caritha, I'm going to find some. I'm going to find. I don't have to look hard. The Old Testament prophecies are full of this kind of approach, and once you understand it and you look at the Old Testament, you will see that it is a pattern. It is a way God operates. He uses parables. He uses stories. He uses the Old Testament is the greatest parable in existence. It's a living parable. It's a life that is lived. It's the culture and history of a people, which is intended to be a lesson book to teach you of something that is to come in the future. So the whole history of the Old Testament is a parable. And this helps us to understand why it is that the things that God did in the Old Testament, he would never do them in the Old Testament. Things that you would consider cruel and harsh and merciless. A man is picking up stones on the Sabbath day, and God says, stone him with stones until he's dead. A woman is caught in adultery in the New Testament, and Jesus tells her, I don't condemn you. Elijah calls down fire on people in the Old Testament in the name of God. And Peter and James and John want to do it in the New Testament, and Jesus says, you don't know what kind of spirit you have. The best way to explain it is to understand one of these experiences was a teaching tool. It was a lesson book. It's not reality. And before you, Brother Judah, let me just explain one other thing that will help to clarify what I mean about it's not a reality. Just consider this. Why did Moses die? And who killed Moses? I like to use that illustration because it's kind of very, very, very transparent. Why did Moses die? He died because he committed one sin. And who killed him? God killed him. He went up on the mountain with God and he never came down. And the Bible says that when he died, he was 120 years old and his eye was not dim and his natural force was not abated. He died with the strength of a 20-year-old man. He did not die of natural causes. He went up on the mountain and God put him to death. Why did he die? Because he committed one sin. Now, he died because of sin. Where is Moses now? If we believe the Bible, Moses was resurrected and taken to heaven. We know he's guaranteed of eternal life. Yet he died because of sin. Under the old system, he had to die. Under the old covenant system, he had to die. But in the new covenant system, where it deals with eternal things, he is living forever. He will live forever. So the old covenant is a model. It's an illustration. The new covenant is reality. God was teaching the lesson that sin is a disease that you cannot treat lightly. So Moses had to die. When a prophet was sent by God to give a message, and God told him not to eat in the place, and he went and ate in the place because somebody deceived him. Because of it, God said he had to die. A lion killed him on the way home. Is that prophet lost? He died in disobedience. Is he lost? No, he was honestly deceived. He was being faithful to God till somebody deceived him. But in the system of the type, in the story, he dies. In the story, he dies because the lesson needs to be taught. But in real life, we will see him in eternity. And there are many of those people, I believe, who died in the Old Testament who will live in eternity because in the story, they have to die because the story is intended to teach lessons. It's when we come to the real end of things in the new covenant, in eternity, we are going to see the reality about some of those Old Testament stories. So don't take them as a final statement. Don't understand the Old Testament as a final statement. It's only in the light of the New Testament we can understand. Before Sister Anita and Brother Al, Brother Judah was first.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Did Jacob literally wrestle with God in terms of how that played out, and that whole account of the night at the brook Jabbok? How do you read that? What happened there?
I read it that it literally happened, Brother Judah. It was an acted parable. God actually came down, or an angel actually came down, grabbed a hold of Jacob, and he actually, in fear of his life, wrestled with this man until morning. That is what Jacob saw, because it was an acted parable. We today look back at the story and we can see what the meaning behind the experience, and we can see what God was trying to bring out of Jacob. But as far as he was concerned, he was simply fighting with a man for his life. It supports what I'm trying to say, that the events of the Old Testament were teaching tools. It's like a story being told, and you have to read the story and think about what is the greatest spiritual meaning. But the things actually happened. They did happen. I mean, the events happened. So it's a principle that the more you understand it, the clearer the old covenant becomes, and the clearer God's ways and purposes become. Sister Anita, you can go ahead.
Brother David, I just want to make a short statement to say that truly God is a merciful God.
Yes.
When you made this statement to say that about the old prophet that disobeyed honestly, and many of those people that were killed in the Old Testament, we're gonna see them in the earth made new. So with regards to that, the thought just came to me that God is not only a merciful God in the New Testament, He was and still is. He was in the Old Testament, and He will always be.
Yes.
It just came up into my spirit that truly God is a merciful God, Brother David.
Yes. And
And
because
yeah,
thank you, Sister Anita. And because people don't understand the parable of the old covenant, what they do is, some people have come to the place where they say that God never instructed these killings in the Old Testament. You know, there are people who say God does not kill. And when you ask them about these Old Testament stories, they simply put down their heads and they refuse to accept that God actually told them to stone a man to death. They refuse to accept that God slaughtered the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. they refuse because they understand that God is a God of love, and that is true. And we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, and this is true. But Brother Matthias, let me just mute you for a moment. I see you. Okay, it's going to be Brother Al, and then you are next in line, but your mic is making noise, so I have to mute you. Right. So if you don't understand this principle, you are caught on the horns of a dilemma. You're caught with a picture of this Old Testament God versus the New Testament Jesus, and it's like two different characters. And you wonder, how could he do these things in the Old Covenant as a God of love and grace and mercy? When you understand it's a story, they experience the story. It is true, but it's like I do something wrong, and God comes to me tonight and says, David, you did this and this. You're going to die. So I die, and it looks like God has been hard to me. No, he isn't. It is to teach a lesson. It's not hard. I go to sleep, but I'm going to come back in the resurrection and I'm going to live forever because God is not going to destroy me because I made a mistake. Sister Anita, Sister Anita, you're kind of cutting me out a little bit there. So you see it in the case of Moses. God was Moses' friend, and when God said you can't see the promised land, Moses says, "Oh, please let me go over and see this goodly land and Lebanon." And God says, "You can't go." Hard. It looks hard. Moses dies under God's judgment. Moses dies under God's judgment. How then can he be saved? Because the judgment was only a type or a representation. It was not real judgment. It was just a symbol of judgment. So he goes to sleep. To us in the world, it's disaster. The man is dead. That's because all we have is this life. All we are concerned about is this life. This life is nothing. God doesn't see with our limited view. God sees eternity, and he knows we're going to be with him in paradise forever. It doesn't matter if we sleep a little bit early or a little bit late on this world. So some people, they become a teaching tool, and the cost is this temporary life. They will live forever. Many of them. I don't say all of them, but many of them. So sometimes when you come upon those puzzling things, Uzzah touches the ark and he drops dead. How is it that the man is trying to prevent the ark from falling over and he drops dead? David was upset, and most of us would have been upset. It's the lesson that is important. Sister Anita, I see that you are
Thank
burning. Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you for the understanding, Brother David. Thank you for the understanding and the principle, behind these lessons. Thank you. God knows what he's doing. And it's for us to get into that knowing and go from there really. Thank you.
Okay, Sister Anita. God bless. Brother Al, and then Brother Matthias afterwards.
Yeah, I was just interested about what you were saying about the Old Testament, the Old Covenant being a parable. So I was thinking about that, and you have three parables in the Bible. Then you have from Adam to Mount Sinai, from Mount Sinai to Jesus, and Jesus telling three turns. There'd be three kind of parables, would it not?
It would be. I would say though that I think the Old Testament in particular is especially designed as a parable. And the scripture themselves say so. When Paul says the law, he's referring to the system of the Old Covenant. He says the law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. And we understand that the schoolmaster signifies a teaching tool, a system that is intended to teach. And you know that many times you go to school, and when you go to your textbooks, they speak about real things, sometimes in figurative language, not always, but they speak about real things. But the textbook is not the real thing. It only speaks about real things, and we can understand the law from that perspective. Sister Bobby, I see you, but Brother Matthias is before you, so let him go ahead, and I'll mute you in the meantime.
Uh,
Brother Matthias,
yes,
you can go ahead.
yes, Brother David. Thank you very much. Brother David, I have sent you an email about a couple of days back. Please check it and reply to me. It's not one of those biblical questions, I promise you. I'm not going to wear you out with any of those questions. Very brief but very important question. completely
All right.
off a different
I,
agenda.
I'll read
Please,
it, Brother Matthew.
please have a look at it and reply to me. Okay, if I may just contribute to this discussion, I think with regards to all those killings and wars and deaths that we see in the Old Testament, my understanding is that it's always good for us to take Jesus, to put on our Jesus lens when we go to the Old Testament. Otherwise, we will see very ugly pictures in the Old Testament. But when I put on my Jesus lens, Jesus, if you remember when the daughter of Jairus died, and when he arrived at Jairus' home, the people were mourning, right? They were weeping and weeping. And Jesus said, "Don't weep, she is not dead." And the people, they laughed at him.
Mm-hmm.
They literally laughed at him. Now, according to Jesus, the daughter of Jairus, in his definition, she was not dead. She was only asleep. And
Yes.
now Jesus is speaking the words of God. So in God's eyes, every one of those who we say have died, they have not really died. They're not really dead in God's eyes. They're only asleep in his eyes. Okay, it's like what an anesthesiologist can do. An anesthesiologist can make you sleep into a death-like sleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
By inoculating anesthesia. But he's also able to bring you back to life. If I do that to you, I am almost guilty of killing you. I don't know how to revive you, how to bring you out of it. But when an anesthesiologist does that, he's not killing you. He is actually, because he knows how to bring you back to consciousness.
Yes.
So the way, and another important element we need to keep in our minds is the war that has been raging between God and Satan. You see, the moment God promised to Adam and Eve in the garden that he would raise a seed out of the woman that would crush the head of the serpent, Satan has been fighting to make sure that the seed would never come. He has been fighting to close the avenue for the coming of the Messiah. And at one moment in history, he had nearly succeeded in doing that. It was in the days of Noah, where God was down to one man. Imagine, from the whole world, God had only one man with whom he could work. The rest of the world, Satan had them in his hands. So now, if God, didn't take any action, what would have happened to Noah and to his descendants? They too might have been overtaken by Satan, which means the avenue for the coming of the Messiah would have been closed forever. Humanity would have been lost forever. In fact, God says there in Genesis 6:13, I see the end of all flesh coming before me. He says, I see it coming before me. I see this destruction, this annihilation of the human race coming before me. And God chose to take action. He chose to intervene. And his intervention was to bring about a worldwide flood.
Yes.
And was incurable, he made them sleep in what we call death, but in his definition, not death. It's just asleep. He put them to sleep so that he could continue to work with Noah, who was still curable and healable. So with this understanding, I don't see an ugly picture of God in the Old Testament itself. I see a God of love in the Old Testament itself. The same God of love that I see in the New Testament.
Right. Thank you, Brother Matthias. And it's important that we understand this, yes, because as somebody disagreed with, I was making a point like this, and somebody disagreed with me, and then I asked the question: do you believe that people, the antediluvians, are coming back to face the judgment? And they said yes. I said, then how can you say that they have already been judged when they are coming back to face judgment? Is God going to judge them twice? And the point I'm making is that the antediluvians were not judged. They were not judged and sentenced. The flood was not a sentence against sin. It was a restrictive device that God used to slow down the spread of evil. Like Brother Matthias is saying, God put them to sleep because if the people of the antediluvian age had been allowed to continue to propagate their ideas and their ways, the world would have been wiped out. Kind of like today. if the evil that is breeding on this planet is allowed to continue unchecked, humanity will completely lose any hope of ever seeing the image of God among us anymore. And that is what was happening in the antediluvian age. That's what was happening in Sodom. So they were not judged. What God did was he judged them in symbol. Their judgment is coming in the future. In the final judgment of the wicked, they are going to come back to stand before God and see their true execution of judgment. Brother
Brother
Raymond,
David, can I ask a question?
sure. Go ahead, Brother Ray.
The antediluvians, in them days, there was no law, there was no gospel, there was just a way of life. So why would they be resurrected to stand for judgment when they lived as they pleased? There was no law against the way they lived, because the law did not come in until Mount Sinai. So I believe those antediluvians are gone. That's it, done deal. The only ones are going to be the only antediluvians that will save is Noah and his family. No?
All right, let me respond, Brother Ray. And Sister Bobby, I kind of bypassed you, but I'm going to come to you as soon as I answer here. Okay? I'm
Try to
sorry.
mute me, try to mute, David, try to mute me because it's not working on this end here in case.
All right. Okay. Let me do that, Brother Ray.
Oh, I want to go in through here. That.
All right. If you look at Romans chapter 2, it's talking about judgment. That's precisely the topic that is being discussed here. It says, when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. Paul is here addressing the question of people who never had the law. Does it mean that there's no standard by which those people can be judged? It says, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. And what is he referring to? In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. What he says here, when you look at the whole passage, he's saying that the Jews will be judged by the law, and those who never had the law, they're going to be judged by a standard which is outside the law. He says their conscience, but of course their consciences are educated by some sense in their society. Their society has a standard of right and wrong, and you either live according to your conscience or you live against your conscience. And God uses this to judge or to establish the kind of condition you were in. So I don't, based on the Bible, there is nobody who will not be judged as long as he has a conscience and he had freedom of choice. So, when the Bible says, I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, the sea gave up the dead and all the rest of it, it's not just referring to the Jews and the Adventists who have the law. It's referring to the entire race, the entire planet, because everybody has some kind of law by which his conscience is modified and governed. Sister Bobby, you can go ahead. Sorry to keep you so long. So you'll need to unmute again, Sister Bobby.
I guess what I guess you're saying just now is that even though a person doesn't have the law like or whatever like we do in the modern times and even in the old times, in themselves they can judge between right and wrong, and if they can judge between right and wrong, then the Lord will use that as a judgment on them, right?
Exactly. Is there anybody in the world, in any culture, who does not know that it is wrong to murder? And there's no culture that I know of that where it is not considered wrong to commit adultery. There are things that are universal. They are in the conscience. They don't need a written law or a stated law. People who have never heard of Christianity, they have a sense of moral responsibility, moral accountability. They believe certain things are right and certain things are wrong. The only persons in any culture who can live by these standards are the people who have some kind of acknowledgement of the deity. They may not know God as we know God, but because of their accountability to God, or they feel a sense of responsibility to God, they endeavor to live by those principles. These people can be judged by their conscience, because everybody has a conscience based on their sense of right and wrong. So that's what I'm saying, Sister Bobby.
Okay, but right now I was looking at this documentary, and there are people over in the Amazon where they still are unreached tribes, and these missionaries, they want to go over and well, anyway, they want to go over and evangelize them, but the people are saying no, they don't want uh, the missionaries to come and evangelize. They need the help. They need water, clean water. They need physical, medicine and stuff like that. But they don't want them to take away their traditions and what they believe and how they worship. And that's what the missionaries want to do. And so, they're in a quandary, of what. But I'm just saying, why can't the people go over and help them first? With their food sources and training and this, and little by little, as they begin to trust you, then maybe you can say something. But to forcefully go over and tell them that what they believe in is wrong, and we're gonna just like the missionaries did in China. At the beginning, they went into China, and the missionaries were telling the Chinese that they were wrong, and trying to wipe them out. And they were really, I was reading, it was really brutal, and that's why they rose up against the missionaries and try and but anyway, that's what I don't understand. So um, I don't, like these people, maybe they died without knowing anything, because cannibalism, people eat people and they think it's right. Not, I mean, people were eating people, um, and they were sacrificing their children and all type, and that's which was the Israelites were supposed to be trying to teach the people not to do that, but instead they start doing it too. But anyway, it's just so confusing about all this stuff that's going on, and how people be reached.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's a big. I see your brother Matthias. It's a huge challenge, Sister Bobby. The thing is that there are billions of people who never heard the gospel, never did, and many of them are dead, and many of them will continue to die, whether not just in the jungles of the Amazon or of New Guinea, but even in places like India, and maybe even in places like the United States of America, because there are people there who, as whether we believe it or not, who just know very little about Christianity. So the thing is that it's the duty of Christians to share the gospel as much as is possible. But one of the things I know is that we still have not reached everybody, and it's going to take a while, and it's going to take the Spirit of God before the entire planet is reached. But it will happen because the Bible predicts it. But in the meantime, people are going to be dying. And and yeah, my wife is saying that she's not hearing me, but I think if I weren't being heard, everybody would let me know. So I think she has a problem.
Yeah, no. You did break out, David.
Yeah,
You did
but
jump out.
the
You
thing
did jump
is,
off a bit.
Okay, it's okay, brother David. I think it's
yeah, okay,
You're back
okay,
now.
sure.
But you did jump off a bit. But you're
These
back now.
these tribes, there's a challenge because I under, the people who are talking about. You're hearing me, Wayne?
we're hearing you, brother David. There's a little delay.
We are,
There's some delay, but we're
The
hearing
people.
you.
All right. Okay. All right. The people who are in charge of the world, they are very obsessed with preserving culture and preserving habits, even if it means that certain races of people or certain nations are to be kept in a state of poverty and to be kept in a primitive state. They believe it was bad for the world that we went to these Christians went to these primitive places and civilized people. They say it made them lose their culture and their lifestyle. Mind you, these are people who are civilized and who have all the amenities of modern civilization, but they still believe that you should leave certain people in their primitive way of living, and they think that Christianity should not be imposed on people because, of course, the world does not believe in Christianity the way we believe in it, that it is vital for salvation. So that's one of the challenges we have. You know, in China and certain places, Christians are so badly persecuted. In North Korea, for example, that it is illegal to be a Christian in some places. It's illegal to try to share something with somebody. So these are the things we have to work against, Sister Bobby. It may be that some of us will die in the process. It's almost certain that will happen, but it doesn't stop the reality that it comes with the territory. It's what it means to be a Christian. In certain things, you can't obey the government. If they tell you you can't share the gospel with somebody, you don't obey the government. You obey the higher governor. You obey Jesus Christ and you go forward, regardless of what anybody says. So, um, that's just the reality of the world we live in, and we just have to take it into consideration as a territory that we are dealing with, and understand that the world is not on the side of God. Brother
Yes.
Matthias, you probably will have the last comment, and then
Yeah.
Sister, you and Sister Anita.
Yeah.
Good night, Brother
Yes.
David. Good night.
All right, Sister Anita, take care. God bless you.
Yeah. Okay. Regarding the Gentiles not having a law, my understanding is that as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, God actually began interceding in three areas. The first area he began interceding was when he said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. And what exactly did God mean when he said that? My understanding is that God meant to say that I will intercede in the hearts and minds of people, the human race, which Satan has taken captive now. He said, I will intervene in their hearts and minds in terms of putting a desire for good and hatred for evil in the hearts and minds of fallen humanity. But his intercession can't be resisted, it can be rejected. And this is when we see these abominable things being committed by Gentiles and heathens who do not know God. Okay, it's not that God has not been interceding in their hearts. It's not like he has not been pleading with them to desire good and to hate evil, but it can be rejected. So when people reject that, you can see them sacrificing their own child or practicing cannibalism and all kinds of evil things because they have rejected God's intercession. It's not like God has not been interested in their hearts and minds. So the law that Paul talks about, where Gentiles, he says, have a law written in their minds which either accuses them or excuses them. Okay, that is actually the result of God interceding in their hearts in terms of placing a desire for good and hatred for evil. And so there is a sense of, everybody has a sense of right and wrong in this way, for which gives God a basis for him to judge everybody at the end of the day.
Sure, Brother Matthias, that makes sense. Yes, thank you for your comment. Brother Claremont.
Yeah. If I could ask you a question, I encounter a few Trinitarians, and one of the main thing that they say that the only way that God could have love is that he had to have someone to love. He's not love of himself, and also before he could
You muted, brother Colin. Because the audio went down.
Oh, I was saying that I come across some Trinitarians that said that God had to love someone in order for him to love, and also he had to be, in order for him to be merciful, he had to have someone to be merciful to. So by we sinning, that's how we show us mercy.
That is I am not going to be polite. That is arrant stupidity, brother Colin. It's arrant stupidity. I at the moment I don't know of anybody that I need to be merciful to. Does it mean that I'm not merciful? Because I'm not actually giving some money to a beggar on the street, or because somebody didn't hurt me and I'm not being forgiving to them, does it mean I'm not merciful? This is it's not even childish reasoning to think that if God doesn't have anybody else, God cannot be a loving God. Because you're a loving God, when the opportunity comes, you exercise that love. But it doesn't mean that you are not love, or you don't have the capacity to love because there's not an object to love. I never loved a child until I had a child. Does it mean I wasn't able to love a child? Well, let me say I had other children around me maybe that I could love. But the idea that you cannot love because there's nobody to love is stupid. I don't think it needs a lot of reasoning to see the foolishness in that kind of thinking. Even if God was entirely alone in the universe, in his heart, there's still the principle of being kind. There's still the principle of being loving. As soon as somebody appears to exercise that love upon, or to bestow that love upon, it appears because it's in his heart already. So that's just another poor excuse for people defending the indefensible Trinity doctrine. That's my frank opinion of it. Nobody ever came to me with that kind of foolish reasoning. Otherwise, I probably would give a very harsh response. But I know that there are people who say that kind of thing, including people like Ty Gibson and David Asherik, who are simply borrowing from the Catholic theologian Augustine, who is the one who first came up with that foolish idea. And they have borrowed it and are parroting it without really even thinking about it themselves.
David.
Thank you,
Yes,
Brother
brother.
David.
You're welcome, my brother. Yes, brother Aye, go ahead.
Um, when I'm understanding the things is like again is legalism again. This is legalism again. It's like I would say that well, the serpent is not dangerous as long as the serpent doesn't bite anybody. The serpent is okay. It's only when the serpent bites somebody that the serpent is dangerous, you know. And because people don't understand the nature, they don't understand the nature of God. So they try to define God with what they see or some actions before they said, it's like, okay, righteousness is right doing. So if you don't do any good, then you're not righteous. So that is legalism.
I agree with you. Yes, brother Raymond.
Yes, it reminded me that David Asherik, he preaches that God allowing his son to die for us at the cross is child sacrifice. And there are building doctrines around that as well.
Yeah, doctrines and ideas that really don't make any sense are springing up, and that happens when people try to defend the indefensible. That's the best thing I can say. It's an attempt to defend what cannot be defended. Then you come up with all kinds of silly ideas. Anyway, I think we are about out of time here for this afternoon, as far as I'm concerned. I just put a little bit of credit on my phone. I'm not sure how long it will hold up, so I think now would be an opportune time for me to just close the meeting officially. If we wish to continue, then we could continue afterwards. But I'd like to